She kissed a stranger in a crowded club to make her ex jealous. His mouth tasted like winter and iron. Everyone thought it was just a random hookup. What no one knew, the man she'd claimed was the vampire king who hadn't felt warmth in 3 centuries, and he'd just decided she was his. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. Mara Torres pushed through the crush of bodies at Crimson Lounge with her heart already racing and her hands shaking from adrenaline and 2 glasses of cheap wine. The kind of reckless energy that came from 3 weeks of her ex Tyler blowing up her phone at 2 in the morning and showing up outside her apartment with coffee he claimed was coincidence, and cornering her at the grocery store to ask if she was seeing someone new, as if he had any right to know. And tonight, he had followed her here. Actually followed her into the club, with his voice too loud and his movements too loose, weaving through the dancers to shout that she was making a mistake and that she was still his, the possessive pronoun cutting through the bass like a slap. And Mara felt the familiar hot shame crawl up her neck because everyone was looking now, watching her ex make a scene, watching her be the girl who could not shake the man who refused to let go. And something in her chest cracked open with pure desperation, the kind that made bad decisions feel like survival. So she did not think, just moved, scanning the crowd for anyone who looked like they could make Tyler back off. Someone tall or intimidating or visibly uninterested in drama, and her eyes landed on a man standing alone near the VIP ropes. Charcoal suit sharp enough to cut, dark hair swept back, pale skin that caught the strobe lights wrong, too smooth, too still, and he was not dancing or drinking or scrolling his phone, just standing there in a pocket of space that the crowd seemed to avoid without realizing it, like people instinctively gave him room, and Mara did not stop to wonder why, just pushed through the last few bodies separating them and grabbed his face with both hands and kissed him hard. His mouth was cold, shockingly cold, not like a person who had been standing in a warm club for even 5 minutes, but cold like metal left outside in winter, and there was a taste underneath, sharp and mineral, like sucking on a penny, like iron and something older, and wrong, completely wrong. But Mara was committed now, her lips pressed against his and her heart hammering against her ribs, and for one suspended second he did not move, did not react, just stood frozen under her touch, and then his hand came up to cup the back of her neck, fingers cool and firm, and he kissed her back with a precision that felt deliberate, controlled, like he was tasting her, testing her. And when she finally pulled away, gasping, her first thought was, please let Tyler have seen that, and her second thought was, what the hell did I just do? Because the man was looking at her with pale gray eyes that did not blink, did not waver, fixed on her face with an intensity that made her skin prickle, and the entire VIP section had gone silent, conversations cut off mid-sentence, drinks paused halfway to mouths, security frozen by the ropes, all of them staring at her and the stranger with expressions she could not read, something between shock and fear, and a dark kind of awe. She became aware of the bass throbbing through the floor, the strobe lights cutting slices of red and blue across his face, the way the crowd around them had pulled back without her noticing, creating a circle of empty space. And when she glanced over her shoulder, Tyler was still there, but he had stopped shouting, his face pale and his eyes wide, and he was backing away, stumbling a little, his gaze locked not on Mara, but on the man behind her, and the bouncer was suddenly at Tyler's elbow, a big guy in black with a headset, leaning in close to say something Mara could not hear, and Tyler nodded jerkily and let himself be steered toward the exit, and Mara felt a sharp kick of relief followed immediately by a cold wash of new fear, because Tyler had been drunk and angry and loud, but he had never looked scared, not like that, not like he had just seen something that made him forget why he was angry in the first place. She turned back to the stranger and tried to step away, but his hand was still on the back of her neck, not gripping, just resting there. a light pressure that somehow felt impossible to break, and his voice when he spoke was low and smooth, almost curious, like he was genuinely interested in her answer when he said, "You taste like fear and wine. Do you know what you have just done?" And Mara opened her mouth to say something dismissive, something like it was just a kiss or thanks for playing along. But the words died in her throat because his eyes had not moved from her face, gray and unblinking, and there was something in his expression that was not quite human, a stillness that went deeper than calm, and she heard herself say, "Just play along for 2 minutes, please," her voice coming out breathless and smaller than she intended, and he tilted his head slightly, studying her, and said 2 minutes, the repetition soft and almost amused. And Mara nodded, even though she was not sure what she was agreeing to, and the noise of the club felt very far away now, muffled, like they were standing inside a bubble of cold air that the music could not quite penetrate. The bouncer returned without Tyler and stopped at the edge of the VIP ropes, hands clasped in front of him, waiting. And the stranger glanced at him and made some small gesture Mara did not catch, a flick of fingers or a tilt of the head, and the bouncer nodded and melted back into the crowd. And Mara realized with a sick jolt that the stranger had just given an order, and it had been obeyed instantly. No questions, no hesitation. And she tried again to step back, but his hand slid down from her neck to her shoulder, still light, still careful, but anchoring her in place. And he said, "What is your name?" And Mara swallowed hard and said, "Does it matter?" Her voice sharper now, a little angry because anger was easier than fear, and the corner of his mouth lifted, not quite a smile, more like recognition of something that pleased him. And he said it will. And the way he said it made it sound like a promise and a threat wrapped together. And Mara felt her pulse kick up again, loud in her ears, and she was suddenly hyper-aware of how close he was, how still he stood, how his chest did not seem to rise and fall with breath, and the taste of iron was still on her tongue. The VIP section around them had not returned to normal. People were still watching, still silent, and Mara caught sight of a woman in a white suit sitting at one of the glass tables, her dark eyes fixed on Mara, with an expression that might have been pity or calculation, and a man in the corner with a drink. He was not drinking, his posture too alert, and Mara understood with a clarity that felt like ice water that everyone here knew the stranger, knew him, and feared him. And she had just walked up to him and kissed him in front of witnesses, like she had any idea what she was doing. And the stranger said, "Mine." Just that one word, quiet and final. And the woman in the white suit looked away first, her jaw tight, and the man in the corner set his drink down and left, and Mara stood there with the stranger's hand on her shoulder, and the taste of winter and iron in her mouth, and the terrible creeping certainty that Tyler had been the least of her problems, that whatever she had just started was going to be so much worse than an ex who could not let go, and the stranger was still looking at her, patient and possessive, like he had all the time in the world to wait for her to understand. And the bass dropped into a new song, heavy and slow, and Mara thought wildly, "This is a mistake. I need to leave. I need to run." But her feet stayed planted on the floor and her hand was still resting against his chest where she had grabbed his suit jacket to pull him down for the kiss. And under her palm there was no heartbeat. Nothing, just cold and stillness, and the faint, expensive weave of fabric. And she knew. She knew with the part of her brain that still believed in survival over logic, that running would be the worst thing she could do, that his eyes would track her and his hand would catch her, and whatever happened next would not be her choice at all. So instead she stood there and met his gaze and tried not to let him see how badly she was shaking, and he smiled then, a real smile, slow and sharp, and said, "I think we should talk." And Mara heard herself say, "Okay," even though every instinct she had was screaming no. And he finally dropped his hand from her shoulder and gestured toward a door at the back of the VIP section, black and unmarked. And Mara walked toward it because what else was she going to do? And behind her, the crowd finally started moving again. conversations resuming in low murmurs, and she heard someone say, "Did she really just kiss him?" And someone else say, "She has no idea, poor thing." And the stranger's hand settled on the small of her back, guiding her, and the door opened onto a hallway lit in cold blue. And Mara stepped through and heard it close behind them, with a sound like a lock sliding home. Mara woke to the sound of her phone alarm screaming at 8 in the morning, and the immediate sick knowledge that last night had actually happened. The club and the kiss, and the stranger with cold lips who had said mine like he meant it. And she lay there for a minute staring at her ceiling with its water stain in the corner, shaped like a hand, and tried to convince herself it had been a weird dream, brought on by too much wine and too much Tyler. But her mouth still tasted like iron, and her shoulders still felt the phantom pressure of his hand. And when she finally dragged herself out of bed and stumbled toward the kitchen, she saw it, a cream envelope on the floor just inside her door, too thick and expensive looking to be junk mail. And she stood there in her oversized shirt and bare feet, staring at it like it might bite. She picked it up, turned it over, no address or stamp, just the envelope itself made of paper that felt like cloth under her fingers, and inside was a single piece of cardstock, heavy and textured, with handwriting in black ink that looked like it had been done with an actual fountain pen, the kind of elegant script that belonged in museums or law offices. And the note said, "You will meet me tonight at 8 p.m. The car will arrive at 7:45. Do not make me come to you, signed L.A." And tucked behind the note was a black business card embossed with a silver symbol, a crown sitting over a chalice, the design raised enough that she could feel it under her thumb. And Mara stood in her tiny kitchen, holding this thing that should not exist, and felt her heart start to race, because how did he know where she lived? How did he get this under her door? And when had he done it? While she was sleeping just 20 feet away. She took a photo of the symbol with her phone and ran it through every reverse image search she could think of, Google and Pinterest, and some sketchy forum that claimed to identify occult imagery. But nothing came back, just a bunch of unrelated crown clip art and wine glasses. And she sat at her kitchen table surrounded by yesterday's design proofs and empty coffee mugs, and tried to decide if she was scared or angry or both, and finally called Jenna, because Jenna would tell her she was overreacting, would laugh and say it was just some rich guy with boundary issues. And sure enough, Jenna picked up on the third ring and listened to Mara's breathless explanation, and then said, "Maybe he is just into you. Let the hot mystery man buy you dinner." And Mara said, "I used him to get rid of Tyler. I do not owe him anything." And Jenna said, "Sure, but he does not know that. He probably thinks you are playing hard to get. Just text him and say you are busy." And Mara looked at the note again and said he did not leave a number, and Jenna was quiet for a second, and then said, "Okay, that is a little weird, but still, probably harmless. Rich guys are always dramatic." And they talked for another 10 minutes about nothing, Jenna's new job, and her terrible roommate, and whether Mara wanted to get brunch this weekend. Normal things, safe things, and by the time Mara hung up, she had almost convinced herself Jenna was right. That this was just an awkward rich guy who thought expensive paper equaled romance, and she threw the business card in the trash and went to shower. The day passed in the usual blur of freelance work and emails, and trying not to check her phone every 5 minutes to see if Tyler had texted, which he had not, which was its own kind of unsettling because Tyler always texted. But maybe the scene at the club had finally scared him off. Maybe seeing her kiss someone else had been the wake-up call he needed, and Mara tried to feel relieved about that and not think about the stranger's gray eyes or the way the VIP section had gone silent, or the word mine hanging in the air like a verdict. And by 7 p.m. she had almost succeeded in pushing it all out of her mind, had convinced herself that 7:45 would come and go and nothing would happen, that the note had been a bluff or a joke or a test she had already passed by ignoring it. At 7:45 exactly, a black town car pulled up outside her building, sleek and expensive, and completely out of place on her street with its cracked sidewalks and overflowing dumpsters, and Mara watched from her third-floor window as the driver got out. a man in a dark suit and cap, and walked up to her building's entrance, and her buzzer rang, the sound shrill in her quiet apartment, and she did not move, just stood there with her arms crossed and her jaw tight, and the buzzer rang again, longer this time, insistent, and then stopped, and Mara waited, heart pounding, and nothing happened. The driver got back in the car and the car just sat there, engine running, and she thought, good, let him wait. Let him realize I am not some girl who jumps when summoned. And she turned away from the window and tried to go back to her laptop. Tried to focus on the logo design she was supposed to finish by tomorrow, but the car was still there. She could feel it like a weight pressing against the building, and at 7:58, her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen, unknown number, and the text said, I am waiting. Just those 3 words. And Mara felt something cold slide down her spine because she had not given him her number either, had not given him anything except a single reckless kiss, and he had her address and her phone number and apparently infinite patience. And she typed back, I did not agree to meet you, hit send, watched the little delivered notification pop up, and then nothing, no response, just silence. And the car stayed outside her building, and Mara sat on her couch and stared at her phone and tried to decide what to do, and the minutes ticked past. 8:05, 8:15, 8:30, and the car did not move, and her phone did not buzz again, and she started to think maybe he would just give up. Maybe this was as far as it went. A test of wills she was winning by sheer stubbornness. And then at 9:34 p.m. her apartment door unlocked from the outside. She heard the deadbolt slide and the handle turn, and she was on her feet before she could think, backing away from the door as it swung open, and he walked in, the stranger from the club, except now he was in her space, in her home, and he looked wrong here, too tall and too sharp and too cold. Like a piece of winter had broken off and learned to walk, and behind him were 2 figures in dark coats, silent and still, and Mara opened her mouth to scream, and he said, do not, just that, his voice quiet and absolute, and her voice died in her throat, and he looked at the 2 figures and said, wait outside. And they turned and left without a word, pulling the door closed behind them. And Mara was alone with him in her tiny cluttered living room, and he looked furious. The first real crack in the icy composure he had worn at the club, his jaw tight and his eyes hard, and he said, you ignored my summons. And Mara found her voice and said, I do not take orders from strangers who break into my apartment. And he smiled at that, sharp and humorless, and said, we are not strangers, not anymore. You made sure of that when you put your mouth on mine in front of my entire court. He moved further into the room, looking around at her second-hand furniture and her stack of books and her coffee table covered in sketches, and he seemed both regal and absurd here, too large for the space, too expensive. And Mara said, get out, or I am calling the police. And he turned to look at her and said, mortal laws do not apply to me. And the way he said mortal made her stomach drop, and he continued, you have no idea what you started last night, what you did. And Mara said it was just a kiss, and he laughed, bitter and sharp, and said, just a kiss. You think I wanted this? I have spent 3 centuries avoiding exactly this. And Mara said then, let me go. And he said, I cannot. The bond does not care what I want, it cares what I need. And she said, what bond? What are you talking about? Her voice rising, and he said, sit down, I am going to explain this once. Mara did not sit, stayed standing with her back near the wall, and he sighed and said, fine, stand if it makes you feel safer. But listen, when you kissed me, you created something called a resonance, a blood bond. It only forms when a vampire recognizes their echoed one, a mortal whose life force mirrors something lost in the vampire's death. And Mara heard the word vampire and felt the floor tilt under her and said, you are insane. And he said, I wish I were. It would be simpler. But no, I am a vampire. I have been for 312 years. And you are my echoed one, which means the bond is already pulling me to you. If you run, I will find you. If you deny it, the bond will tighten until it drives us both mad. Resonance does not care about convenience or consent. It just is. and I am here to offer you a choice. Come willingly and learn the rules, or I will invoke the covenant, an ancient law that allows vampires to claim mortals who trigger resonance, and either way, you are mine now. The only question is whether you walk into this with your eyes open or kicking and screaming. Mara stared at him and tried to find the lie, the angle, the hidden camera that would make this make sense. But his expression was serious and tired and frustrated, and she said, "What happens if I refuse?" And he said, "Then I invoke the covenant and take you by force. And I would rather not. I value consent, even when the universe does not. But I will do what I must to survive, and right now survival means keeping you close." And Mara said, "This is insane. You are talking about kidnapping." And he said, "I am talking about an ancient supernatural law that predates your country by centuries. Mortal courts have no jurisdiction here, and if you try to fight me, you will lose. So I am asking you, please, come with me tonight. Let me show you what you are dealing with. Let me explain the rules before you make a decision that will take the choice away from both of us." She looked at him, really looked, and saw the tension in his shoulders and the tightness around his eyes, and the way he was standing very still like movement cost him something. And she realized with a sick jolt that he was telling the truth, or at least he believed he was. And whether he was a vampire or just a very rich, very delusional man with enough power to make people bow and enough skill to unlock her door without a key, the result was the same. He was not going to let her walk away, and fighting would only make it worse. So she said one night, "I will give you one night to explain, and then I am leaving." And he said agreed, and gestured to the door, and Mara grabbed her phone and her keys with shaking hands and followed him out into the hallway where the two silent figures waited. And they went down the stairs and out to the black car that was still idling at the curb. And Mara got in, because what choice did she have? And the door closed with a sound like a coffin lid, and they drove. The city slid past the tinted windows, familiar streets turning strange in the dark. And Mara sat as far from him as the back seat allowed and watched the buildings get taller and older as they moved into the historic quarter, brick and iron and narrow streets that still had gas lamps. And finally the car stopped in front of a sleek high-rise that looked like a shard of black glass punched into the skyline, and he said, "Welcome to the glass tower." And Mara got out and looked up and up at the building that disappeared into the low clouds, and he put his hand on the small of her back, light and cold through her jacket, and guided her inside. The lobby was all marble and chandeliers, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city like a kingdom spread out for inspection. And there were people here, beautiful people in expensive clothes, and they stopped talking when he walked in, turned to look. And every single one of them bowed, a slight incline of the head, respectful and automatic. And Mara felt like she was walking through a dream. Nothing made sense, and he led her to an elevator with doors that looked like hammered silver, and they went up, up, up. And when the doors opened, a woman was waiting, tall and elegant in a white suit, dark hair pulled back severe, and she looked at Mara with eyes that were kind and pitying and assessing all at once. And he said, "Celine, brief her. I will be in my office." And he walked away down a hallway lit in cold white light, and Celine smiled and said, "You must be Mara. Come, let us talk." And she led Mara into a conference room that was all glass walls and leather chairs, and poured her a cup of coffee from a carafe that was still hot, and said, "I imagine you have questions." Celine talked for an hour, crisp and efficient, laying out the rules like a lawyer presenting a case. Vampires have ruled Ashford City in secret for 400 years under the Midnight Accords, a treaty with the human government that keeps the peace. We handle the night, they handle the day, and resonance bonds are sacred but rare. The last one was 80 years ago. If you accept the bond, you will be protected and provided for and bound to Lucian until one of you dies. If you refuse, he can invoke the covenant and claim you anyway, but it will break his court's trust. Vampires value consent. In resonance bonds, forced claims are seen as weakness, a king who cannot earn his. Echoed one's loyalty as a king who cannot control himself, and Mara said, "What happens if I run?" And Celine's smile went sharp and she said, "He will find you. And next time he will not ask nicely. The bond is already forming. You will feel it soon, his emotions bleeding into yours, your location always known to him. Resonance does not lie. If the bond formed, it is because you two are mirrors, broken in the same places." And Mara said, "I did not ask to be anyone's mirror." And Celine said, "Neither did he. But here we are, and the question now is what you do with it. Accept and gain a protector, a partner, immortality if you choose it down the line. Refuse, and he invokes the covenant, and you lose your choice entirely. Those are your options. I suggest you choose wisely." And Mara sat there in the glass room overlooking the glittering city and felt the walls close in. Not literal walls, but the sense that every path led to the same place, that the choice was an illusion. And she said, "If I say no." And Celine looked at her with something like respect and said, "Then he will invoke the covenant, and he will hate himself for it, but he will do it. Lucien has survived 3 centuries by doing what is necessary, and you are necessary now." And Mara said, "I need to think." And Celine said, "Of course, you have until dawn. He will not force you before then." And Mara stood and walked to the window and looked down at the city that had been ruled by vampires for 400 years and she had never known, and wondered what else she did not know. What other laws and bonds and ancient claims were waiting in the dark? And behind her, Celine said, "For what it is worth, I think you will choose to stay. You have the look of someone who is tired of running." And Mara did not answer because she did not know if it was true. Did not know anything anymore, except that the stranger from the club was named Lucien, and he was a king, and he had decided she was his. And the only question left was whether she would walk into the cage or be dragged. Lucien stood in the doorway of his private office at 3 in the morning and stared at the surveillance monitor that showed every corner of the glass tower. A security system Celine had insisted on installing 50 years ago when the Accords were first tested by mortal investigators, and he had been watching the guest suite on the 14th floor for the past 4 hours, waiting for Mara to do what every other mortal had done when faced with the reality of vampire law: cry or scream, or try to break the windows, or seduce the guards, or simply curl up and shut down. But she had done none of those things. Had instead showered and changed into the clothes Celine had left for her, and then walked out of the suite at midnight. And the guards had moved to stop her, and Lucien had sent a single text to their captain saying let her walk, curious to see where she would go, whether she would try the elevator or the stairs, or simply wander the halls looking for an exit that did not exist. But Mara had done none of those things either. She had walked with apparent purpose through 3 hallways and up 2 flights of stairs, like she had memorized the layout from the brief tour Celine had given her, and she had ended up in the library, the glass-walled room on the 16th floor that held 4 centuries of vampire history, covenant texts and accords treaties, and the private journals of every king who had ruled Ashford City since its founding. And Lucien had watched her walk in and look around, and then start pulling books off the shelves. He had assumed she was looking for something to read, a distraction, but after an hour she was still at it, pulling down heavy leather-bound volumes and flipping through them with the focused intensity of someone on a hunt, and Lucien had felt the first stirring of unease and then curiosity, and finally he could not stand it anymore and left his office and walked through the silent tower to the library and found her sitting cross-legged on the floor surrounded by open books, her hair falling out of its ponytail, and her eyes red-rimmed but alert. And she did not look up when he entered, just said, "I know you are watching me. The cameras are not exactly subtle." And Lucien stopped in the doorway and said, "Most mortals do not go looking for reading material when they have just learned vampires are real." And Mara said most mortals probably do not kiss vampire kings by accident either. "I figure I should know what I am dealing with." And she turned a page in the book on her lap, something in Latin that Lucien recognized as a covenant text from the 1700s. And he said, "Can you even read that?" And she said, "No, but I can read this," and held up a tablet that was showing a scanned translation. "Your librarian left it on the desk. Very helpful." And Lucien felt something cold and sharp move through his chest. half alarm and half something else, something he had not felt in so long he almost did not recognize it, and he walked further into the room and said, "What are you looking for?" Mara looked up at him finally, her dark eyes measuring, and said, "Loopholes. You said the covenant allows you to claim me, but laws always have exceptions, and I am betting a 400-year-old treaty has a few." And Lucian laughed before he could stop himself, a short, bitter sound, and said, "You are researching vampire law. And Mara said you gave me until dawn to decide. I am using my time." And Lucian said, "And what have you found?" Genuinely curious now. And Mara stood and picked up one of the books, flipped to a page marked with a torn piece of paper, and said this: Covenant Section 12, Subsection 4. If a mortal can prove the bond was triggered by coercion, not free will, the covenant is void. And Lucian went very still, and Mara continued, "I kissed you because my ex was harassing me. I was scared and desperate, and I grabbed the nearest person who looked like they could make him go away. That is textbook coercion, external threat forcing my action, which means the bond was not formed by free will, which means the covenant does not apply." And Lucian stared at her and felt the ground shift under him because in 312 years, no mortal had ever done this, had ever turned his own law against him, and he said, "You want to argue coercion in front of the council?" And Mara said, "Unless you would rather negotiate." He moved closer, slowly, watching her watch him, and said, "What are you proposing?" And Mara took a breath and said, "I will stay for 30 days. Let the bond settle. See if this resonance thing is real or just vampire wishful thinking. And if after 30 days I still want to leave, you will argue to your council that the kiss was coerced and the covenant does not apply. You will let me go." And Lucian said, "And if I refuse?" And Mara's smile was sharp, and he saw the steel in her that he had missed at the club, and she said, "Then I will make the case myself, publicly, in front of your council. And I will bring every scrap of evidence of Tyler's harassment, texts and emails and witness statements, and I will expose your court to mortal scrutiny, because if I am going down, I am taking your precious accords with me." And Lucian felt something hot and wild rise in his chest, half fury and half exhilaration. And he said, "You are threatening me." And Mara said, "I am negotiating. There is a difference. You said you value consent. Prove it." He could invoke the covenant right now, could call the guards and have her taken to his private rooms and bound with blood magic that would make running impossible. But the thought of it made him sick, made him feel like the monster he had spent 3 centuries trying not to become. And more than that, he was fascinated, utterly fascinated by this mortal woman who had stumbled into his world by accident and was now trying to rewrite the rules. And he heard himself laugh again, a real laugh this time, rusty and bitter and astonished, and said, 300 years, and no one has ever turned the covenant against me. I think I might be in love with you already." And Mara said, "Do not be. This is a contract, not a romance." And Lucian said, "We will see," and realized he meant it, that some part of him wanted to see what 30 days with her would do, whether the bond would deepen or break, whether she would choose him or walk away, and the uncertainty of it was terrifying and intoxicating in equal measure. He said, "I will agree to your terms, but I have one of my own. If you stay the 30 days and the bond deepens, if you can feel my emotions and I can sense your location, proof that the resonance is real, then you accept it willingly. No more talk of coercion or loopholes. You stay." And Mara was quiet for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. And then she said, "And if the bond does not deepen?" And Lucian said, "Then I will argue your case myself. I will tell the council the kiss was coerced and release you from any claim. You will walk away free." And Mara said you would do that, risk your throne for a technicality. And Lucian said I would do that to prove I am not a monster, that consent matters even when the bond does not care. And he saw something shift in her expression, a softening he had not expected. And she said, "Okay, 30 days," and held out her hand. Lucian looked at her hand, small and mortal and warm, and then took it, felt her skin burn against his palm like a brand, and the shock of contact sang through the bond, louder and clearer than it had been even at the club, and he knew she felt it too from the way her breath caught. And they stood there in the glass library at 3 in the morning, with the city sleeping below, and shook hands like business partners making a deal. And Lucian thought, this is the most dangerous thing I have ever done, more dangerous than being turned, more dangerous than taking the throne. Because this mortal woman had just flipped every assumption he had about power and control, had turned herself from prisoner into negotiator with nothing but 4 hours of research and the audacity to believe she could win, and he wanted to see what she would do next. Wanted it with a hunger that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with the fact that she was looking at him like he was a problem to solve instead of a king to fear. And it had been so long since anyone had looked at him like he was just a man who could be challenged and bargained with and maybe even beaten. He released her hand and stepped back, putting distance between them before he did something stupid like pull her closer and said Celine will draw up the contract in the morning, legal and binding, 30 days starting tomorrow at sunset. And Mara said, why sunset? And Lucian said, because the bond will be stronger at night. If it is going to deepen, you will feel it when I am at full strength. No point in testing it during the day when I am half asleep. And Mara nodded slowly, filing that information away. And Lucian could see her mind working, cataloging his weaknesses. And he said, you are planning how to fight me. And Mara said, I am planning how to survive you. There is a difference. And Lucian said, you are going to be trouble. And Mara said, you have no idea. And smiled. And it was not a soft smile or a seductive smile. It was the smile of someone who had just gained ground in a battle they had expected to lose. And Lucian felt the bond pull tight in his chest, sharp and undeniable, and thought, yes, trouble, exactly the kind he had been avoiding for 300 years. And now it was standing in his library in borrowed clothes with ink on her fingers and fire in her eyes, and he had just agreed to give her 30 days to decide if she wanted him, and the waiting was going to kill him. He said you should sleep. Tomorrow will be long. I will need to explain you to the council. And Mara said, what will you tell them? And Lucienne said the truth, that my echoed one is smarter than I gave her credit for, and we have made a bargain. They will not like it. Forced claims are cleaner, but they will accept it, because the alternative is a public fight that could expose us. And Mara said good, and started gathering the books to put them back on the shelves. And Lucian said, leave them. The staff will handle it. And Mara said, I make my own messes, and kept shelving books. And Lucian watched her, and thought she has no idea what she has done, no idea that turning the covenant into a negotiation has just made her more valuable than any echoed one in history. Because consent given freely after full knowledge is worth more than 1,000 forced bonds, the council will see that even if they do not want to admit it, and if she chooses me at the end of 30 days, it will be unassailable. No one will be able to question my claim or my right to protect her. But if she walks away, and he let the thought trail off because he could not finish it, could not imagine what it would feel like to let her go after 30 days of the bond deepening, of feeling her emotions and knowing her location and learning the shape of her mind, resonance unfulfilled would burn him out, leave him feral, and he would have to step down from the throne and go into the long sleep, the vampire equivalent of death, and he had just agreed to risk it for a mortal who had known him for less than a day. Mara finished with the books and turned to face him, and said, I have one more question. And Lucian said, ask. And Mara said, why did you agree? You could have just invoked the covenant tonight, forced me. And Lucian was quiet for a moment, and then said, because you looked me in the eye and demanded a choice, and I have spent 3 centuries taking choices away from people, and I am tired of it, tired of being the thing mortals fear in the dark, and if there is even a chance that you might choose me freely, might want this bond instead of just enduring it, then it is worth the risk. And Mara said, even if it kills you, and Lucian said, even then, and meant it, and saw her absorb that, saw the way her expression shifted from wary to something softer, not trust, but maybe the beginning of it. And she said, okay, 30 days. And Lucian said 30 days. And they stood there in the glass room with their reflections caught in the windows like ghosts. The vampire king who had ruled for a century, and the mortal woman who had turned his law into a weapon. And Lucian thought this is the midpoint, the moment everything changes. Before this, she was a problem to solve. And after this, she is a partner to bargain with. And the bond hummed between them, satisfied and hungry, waiting to see what 30 days would make of them, whether they would end as king and echoed one, or as two people who had tried and failed to fit together. And for the first time in decades, Lucian did not know the answer. And the uncertainty of it felt like being alive. Mara spent the first day of the 30-day deal trying to pretend everything was normal, which was impossible when normal meant being trapped in a glass tower ruled by vampires and bound by a supernatural bond to a 300-year-old king who had agreed not to force her into anything, but also made it very clear that running would be pointless. And Celine had shown her the boundaries of her freedom that morning over coffee that was too expensive and too perfect. You can move through the tower as you like, all floors except the sublevels where the council meets, and the 20th floor, which is Lucien's private residence. You are a guest under resonance terms, not a prisoner. And Mara had said, "What is the difference?" And Celine had smiled that sharp smile and said a prisoner would be in chains. You are in a contract. There is a difference, even if it does not feel like one. And Mara had taken her coffee and her borrowed tablet and gone looking for a quiet corner to think. She found the observation deck on the 18th floor, a room that was more window than wall, floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the city in every direction. And she sat in one of the low chairs with her knees pulled up and tried to sketch, her usual method of thinking through problems, letting her hand move while her brain worked in the background. And she was halfway through a design that was supposed to be a logo for a coffee shop, but kept turning into geometric patterns that looked like cages when it hit her. A wave of loneliness so crushing and so sudden that she gasped and dropped her pencil. It was not hers. She knew that immediately. Her loneliness was familiar. A low-grade ache she had lived with since her parents died when she was 19, since she had built a life out of freelance work and careful independence and not letting anyone close enough to leave. But this was different. This was old and deep and endless. A loneliness that had calcified into something solid. A weight that had been carried so long, it had become part of the architecture. And Mara sat there with her hand pressed to her chest and thought, what is happening? And then remembered Lucien's words from last night. The bond is deepening faster than I expected. You will feel more soon. And she realized this was it. The emotional bleed. His loneliness bleeding into her through the bond, and it was so strong she could barely breathe around it. She stood up, shaky, and followed the feeling like a compass needle, through the observation deck and down 2 flights of stairs and along a hallway she had not explored yet. And the loneliness got stronger the closer she got. A pull in her chest that was part pain and part direction. And she found herself standing outside a door of dark wood with no nameplate, and she knocked without thinking, and heard his voice say, "Come in," and she pushed the door open. Lucien's office was exactly what she would have expected if she had thought about it. Dark wood and low light and shelves lined with books that looked older than the city itself, a desk that was more art than furniture, and one wall dominated by a painting. A portrait of a woman in 19th century dress, dark hair and dark eyes, and a smile that was mid-motion, like she had been laughing when the artist caught her, and Lucian was standing in front of it with his back to the door, and the loneliness radiating off him was so strong, Mara almost turned around and left. But she said, "I felt it, your loneliness. It is loud." And Lucien went very still, and then turned to look at her, and his expression was carefully blank, but his eyes gave him away, shock and shame, and something that might have been relief. He said, "The bond is deepening faster than I expected. You will feel more soon." And Mara stepped into the room and closed the door behind her, because this felt private, felt like something that should not happen in a hallway where anyone could see. And she said, "Who was she?" gesturing to the painting, and Lucian looked at the portrait for a long moment and said, "Someone I failed, a long time ago." And Mara moved closer, studying the woman's face, the way the artist had captured her mid-laugh, the way her dress was dark green and her hands were reaching for something outside the frame. And Mara said, "She looks like me." And Lucian said, "Yes." And Mara said, "Is that why the bond formed?" And Lucian said partly, "Her name was Elise. She was my sister, my human sister. She drowned saving a child who had fallen through ice on the river, and I was turned the same night trying to save her. I failed. I was too slow. I watched her die, and then I became this. And I have carried that failure for 312 years. And the bond recognized you because you have her recklessness, her bravery. The way you kissed a stranger to save yourself was exactly the kind of thing Elise would have done. Throw herself into danger without thinking, because the alternative was worse. And the bond does not care about romance or compatibility. It cares about resonance, about finding the shape of what was lost. And you are the shape of my sister, my failure, my wound. And I did not want this, did not want to see her in you, but the bond does not care what I want. Mara stood in front of the painting and felt the loneliness pressing against her ribs, and thought, "I am an echo of a dead woman, a ghost wearing my face," and she should have been angry about it, should have felt used or reduced or erased. But instead she felt something else, a deep, unexpected understanding, because she knew what it was like to carry grief that did not fade, knew what it was like to be shaped by loss, and she said, "I am not her." And Lucian said, "I know, but the bond does not." And Mara turned to look at him and saw the way he was holding himself, too still, too controlled, like he was afraid if he moved he would shatter. And she said, "You have been alone for 300 years." And Lucian said, "Not alone. I have the court, the council, Celine." And Mara said, "That is not the same, and you know it. You have been surrounded by people who fear you and need you and serve you. But no one has seen you. Not really. Not the part that is still human." And Lucian looked at her, and something in his face cracked, just a little, and he said no. And it was so quiet she almost missed it. And Mara thought, "I should leave. I should walk out of this room and put distance between us before the bond pulls me under." But her feet stayed planted on the floor, and she said, "The bond is making us vulnerable." And Lucian said, "Yes, it will get worse. You will feel my emotions more clearly, and I will know where you are always, what you are feeling. The bond does not believe in privacy." And Mara said, "I did not sign up for this." And Lucian said, "Neither did I." But here we are, and they stood there in the dim office with the painting of Elise watching, and the loneliness thick enough to choke on, and Mara did not comfort him, did not cross the room and touch his shoulder or say something soft. But she did not leave either, just stood there in the doorway, caught between empathy and self-preservation. And finally Lucian said, "You should go. This is not your burden to carry." And Mara said, "Apparently it is. That is what the bond means, right? Your burdens become mine." And Lucian said, "Only if you let them. You can still walk away at the end of 30 days. And Mara said, "Can I? Because it does not feel like it." And Lucian said, "I will let you go even if it kills me. I promised." And Mara heard the truth in it, heard the cost, and thought, "He means it. He will actually let me walk away, and it will burn him out, and he will do it anyway, because he values my choice more than his survival." And that was the moment she started to see him as something other than a predator, started to see the man hollowed out by grief and frozen at the moment of his worst failure. And it terrified her how easy it would be to care about him, how the bond was stripping away her defenses faster than she could rebuild them. The next day, Mara woke to a text from Tyler at 2:48 in the afternoon, which meant she had slept through the morning for the first time in years. Her body finally crashing from 2 days of adrenaline and fear and supernatural bonds. And the text said, "I know where you are. I know what he is. We need to talk." And Mara stared at it for a full minute before deleting it, her hands shaking. Because how did Tyler know? How did he find her? And more importantly, what did he mean by "I know what he is"? And she thought about telling Lucian, and then decided against it. She did not need him solving her Tyler problem with violence, did not need more blood on her hands even if it was metaphorical, and she got dressed and went to find coffee and tried to pretend the text had not happened. 10 minutes later, Celine found her in the tower's kitchen, a gleaming space of steel and marble that looked like it belonged in a restaurant, and said, "Your ex is in the lobby." And Mara said, "What?" And Celine said, "Tyler Vaughn. He showed up 5 minutes ago demanding to see you, shouting about monsters and kidnapping. Security has detained him, but Lucian wants to know how you want to handle it." And Mara felt her stomach drop, because this was exactly what she had been afraid of. Tyler escalating, Tyler making a scene, Tyler refusing to let go even when letting go was the only sane option, and she said, "I will handle it." And Celine raised an eyebrow and said, "Lucian offered to handle it. Vampires speak for make him disappear." And Mara said, "No, absolutely not. I will talk to him." And Celine said, "Are you sure? He looks unhinged." And Mara said, "I am sure," and went to the elevator with her heart pounding. The lobby was full of people, mortals and vampires mixed together in expensive clothes conducting business that looked normal, until you noticed the way some of them moved too fast or stood too still, and Tyler was in the center of it being held by two security guards in black suits, and he looked terrible, unshaven and wild-eyed, clutching a folder of papers. And when he saw Mara step out of the elevator, he started shouting, "Mara, thank God! You have to get out of here! He is not human. None of them are. I have proof." And Mara walked toward him slowly, aware of every eye in the lobby turning to watch, and said, "Tyler, you need to leave." And Tyler said, "I am not leaving without you. Do you have any idea what he is, what they all are? I have been researching. There are blogs, conspiracy sites. People have been trying to expose Ashford City's shadow government for years. And it is real. It is all real. Vampires run this city, and you are living with their king." And Mara heard the word vampires echo through the lobby and saw the way the crowd went still. Predators assessing a threat. And she said, "Tyler, stop talking." And Tyler said, "No, you need to hear this. He is a monster, and he has kidnapped you, and I am going to the press. I am going to expose all of them, unless you leave with me right now." Mara looked up and saw Lucian standing on the mezzanine, hands on the railing, watching with an expression that was perfectly calm and utterly deadly. And she thought, "He is going to kill Tyler. He is going to move faster than human sight and snap his neck, and there will be nothing I can do to stop it." And she turned back to Tyler and said, "I know." And Tyler stopped mid-rant and said, "What?" And Mara said, "I know what he is. I know what they all are, and I am staying anyway." And Tyler stared at her like she had slapped him and said, "You know?" And Mara said yes, and Tyler said, "And you are choosing to stay, choosing him." And Mara took a breath and said, "I do not want you, Tyler. I never did. And whatever you think you know, it will not change that. I am not here because he kidnapped me. I am here because I would rather be here than anywhere you are." And it felt like breaking a chain, saying it out loud, saying the truth. She had been too afraid or too guilty to say for 3 years. And Tyler's face went red and then white, and he lunged at her, hands reaching, and Lucienne was suddenly there between them, moving faster than Mara's eyes could track. One hand around Tyler's throat, lifting him off the ground, and his eyes were black, completely black, no white, no iris, just endless dark, and his voice when he spoke was dead and cold, and said, "Touch her again, and there will not be enough left of you to bury." Mara heard herself shout, "Do not!" the word ripping out of her, and Lucian froze, his hand still around Tyler's throat, but not squeezing, and he turned his head to look at her, and his eyes were still black, and Mara said, "Please, let him go, please." And Lucian stared at her for a long moment, and then dropped Tyler, who crumpled to the marble floor gasping. And Lucian stepped back, and his eyes faded back to gray, and Tyler scrambled to his feet and ran, leaving his folder of evidence scattered across the lobby floor. And the security guards did not stop him, just watched him go. And the lobby was silent, every person frozen, and Mara stood there shaking and thought, "I just saved Tyler's life with one word. Lucian stopped because I asked him to, and she did not know what to do with that, did not know what it meant that a vampire king had listened to her over his own instincts. And Lucian said, "You just saved his life. I hope you will not regret it." And Mara said, "I could not let you kill him." And Lucian said, "Even though he threatened to expose us, even though he put you in danger." And Mara said, "Even then, I will not have blood on my hands." And Lucian looked at her with something that might have been respect or frustration or both, and said, "He will come back. You know that. He will not stop until he destroys you or I destroy him." And Mara said, "Then we will deal with it when it happens. But not like this. Not with murder." And Lucien said, "As you wish," and walked away. And Mara stood in the lobby surrounded by vampires and mortals who had just watched her give orders to a king and have them obeyed, and thought everything just changed. I just publicly chose his world over Tyler, and there is no taking it back now. Lucian sat in the council chamber 2 nights later and tried not to show how much he wanted to kill every single one of the ancient vampires staring at him from their stone chairs. 5 figures who had shared rule of Ashford City with him for a century, and who currently looked at him like he had lost his mind. And the eldest, a woman named Cordelia who had been turned during the French Revolution, and still carried herself like an aristocrat heading for the guillotine, said, "Let me see if I understand. You have allowed a mortal who knows our nature to walk free. You have given your echoed one an escape clause from the resonance bond, and you have made a deal that puts our entire court at risk, all because you value consent." And Lucian said yes, and Cordelia said, "You have gone soft for a mortal girl. Do you know what that looks like to the court?" And Lucian said, "It looks like I value consent, something you have all forgotten. The covenant was never meant to be a weapon. It was meant to protect resonance bonds from outside interference, and forcing a claim when the mortal is unwilling defeats the entire purpose." And another council member, Marcus, old enough to remember when Rome fell, said the purpose is continuation. Vampires need echoed ones to stay sane, to remember what it means to be human. And if we allow our king to let his echoed one walk away, we set a precedent that will destroy us. What happens when the next resonance bond forms and the mortal demands the same deal? What happens when they all start negotiating instead of accepting? And Lucian said then, "We prove the bonds are real. We prove that resonance is worth choosing freely." And Cordelia laughed, bitter and sharp, and said, "You are a fool. You are gambling your throne and your sanity on a mortal who has known you for 3 days." And Lucian said, "I am gambling on the possibility that consent given freely is worth more than 1,000 forced claims. And if I am wrong, I will step down. But I will not force her. I will not become the monster she fears." The council was silent for a moment, and then Marcus said, "The mortal's ex knows about us. He was in our lobby shouting about vampires and shadow governments. He has evidence, or thinks he does, and you let him leave. Why?" And Lucian said, "Because Mara asked me to." And Cordelia said, "And you obeyed, a king obeying a mortal. Do you hear yourself?" And Lucian said, "I heard her, and I chose to listen. And if that makes me weak in your eyes, then vote me out, invoke conclave right. But I will not kill a mortal to prove I am strong." And the council exchanged glances, silent communication passing between them, and finally Cordelia said, "We will give you 1 week. If the bond has not solidified by November 13th, if Mara has not accepted the resonance willingly, we will invoke conclave right, an emergency vote to override you and claim her by council decree, and you will lose your throne for incompetence." And Lucian felt the trap close around him, neat and absolute, and said, "You are forcing my hand." And Cordelia said, "We are protecting the court. You have until November 13th to prove the bond is real. Prove she chooses you freely, or we will choose for her." And Lucian said, "And if I refuse?" And Marcus said, "Then we strip you of your kingship tonight and claim her anyway. At least this way you have a chance. 7 days to win her over. 7 days to show her the bond is worth accepting. We are being generous." And Lucian thought generous. They are backing me into a corner and calling it a gift. If I force Mara, I lose her trust. If I do not, the council forces her anyway, and I lose everything. And he said, "I accept your terms, 7 days." And Cordelia smiled and said, "Good, we will be watching. The entire court will be watching." Make sure your mortal understands what is at stake. And Lucian left the council chamber and climbed the stairs to the tower's roof, because he needed air, needed to think, and stood at the edge looking down at the city he had ruled for 100 years, and thought, I just gambled my throne on a woman who might walk away. I have 7 days to prove the bond is real without forcing it. 7 days to make her choose me freely. And if I fail, the council claims her and I lose everything. My throne, my sanity, my remaining humanity. And the worst part is, I would do it again. I would make the same choice, because the alternative is forcing her, and I cannot. I will not, even if it costs me everything. And he felt the bond pull tight in his chest. Felt Mara somewhere below him in the tower, awake and afraid and thinking too hard. And he thought, 7 days. That is all I have. 7 days to convince her that choosing me is not the same as choosing captivity, and I have no idea how to do that without becoming exactly what she fears. Mara woke at 4:22 in the morning, choking on grief that was not hers, drowning in a memory that did not belong to her. And for a confused moment she did not know where she was or when she was, because she was standing by a river in winter, and there was ice cracking under her feet, and a woman in the water, dark hair spreading like ink, and Mara was screaming, no, 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 please, and hands were reaching for the woman but too slow, always too slow, and the woman's eyes were open and empty, and the ice was red with blood, and someone was saying, I can save you, I can give you eternity, but the price is her life. You have to choose. And Mara heard herself say yes, heard the desperation and the rage and the pleas, I will do anything, and then teeth in her throat and cold spreading through her veins like poison, and the woman in the water sinking deeper. And Mara woke gasping in the guest suite bed with tears on her face and Lucian's guilt like a knife in her chest. She knew immediately it had been his memory, his nightmare. The bond was deep enough now that his dreams bled into hers, and she had just lived through the night he was turned, had felt what he felt watching his sister drown, had heard him make the choice that would haunt him for 300 years, trade Elisa's life for his own immortality, and the guilt was so strong Mara thought she might be sick, and she stumbled out of bed and through the tower's silent hallways, following the pull of the bond, until she found herself pushing through a door onto the rooftop. The rooftop garden was under a glass dome that let in the night sky, stars faint through the city's light pollution, and there were winter roses blooming in raised beds, white flowers that should not exist in November but did anyway, vampire magic keeping them alive. And Lucien was standing at the edge of the dome looking out at the city, and he was in shirt sleeves despite the cold. And when Mara walked toward him, he turned and saw her face and went very still and said, You felt it. And Mara said, I saw her, Elise. I felt what you felt when she died. And Lucian closed his eyes and said, I am sorry. The bond should not have gone that deep yet. And Mara said, Stop apologizing for feeling things. It is the only reason I am still here. And Lucian opened his eyes and looked at her and said, What do you mean? And Mara said, If you were just a predator, just a monster who wanted to own me, I could hate you, I could fight you. But you are not. You are a man who has been carrying his sister's death for 3 centuries, a man who traded his humanity to save her and failed anyway. And the bond is making me feel that, making me understand that, and I do not know what to do with it. Lucien was quiet for a moment, and then said, The bond is two-way now. I have been feeling you too. Your fear of Tyler, your shame at needing help, your loneliness. The way you have built walls so high you forgot what it feels like to let someone in, and we are bleeding into each other, Mara. This is what resonance does. It strips away all the defenses and leaves you raw, and I know it is terrifying, but it is also proof the bond is real. And Mara said, If I leave, will it kill you? And Lucian said eventually, Resonance unfulfilled burns out a vampire's remaining humanity. I would go feral within a year, maybe less, and the council would put me down. But I would rather die than keep you prisoner. I told you that. I meant it. And Mara heard the absolute truth in his voice, and thought he would let me walk away knowing it would kill him. He values my choice that much. And something in her chest cracked open. She crossed the space between them without thinking, reached up and pulled his face down to hers and kissed him. And his mouth was still cold, but it did not taste wrong anymore, tasted like winter, and something sharper. And this time when he kissed her back, it was not careful or controlled. It was hungry and desperate and relieved, like he had been waiting for this, waiting for her to choose him instead of being chosen. And when she pulled back, they were both breathing hard, and Mara said, "I am not ready to stay forever, but I am not ready to leave either." And Lucien said then, "Stay until you are." And Mara said, "Is that enough?" And Lucien said, "It is everything." And he took off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders, the fabric still warm from his body, even though his skin was cold, and they stood there under the glass dome, with the winter roses blooming around them, and the city waking up below. And Mara thought, "This is the moment I stop fighting. This is the moment I admit the bond is real, and I want it. Want him." And the terror of it was only matched by the relief. Mara spent the next day trying to pretend the kiss had not changed everything, trying to go back to the careful distance she had maintained since arriving at the tower. But the bond would not let her. She could feel Lucien everywhere now, his presence like a second heartbeat. And when Celine found her in the observation deck at 6:13 that evening, Mara knew immediately something was wrong from the look on her face, and Celine said, "We have a problem." Tyler posted a video, and Mara felt her stomach drop. Celine pulled up the video on her tablet, shaky footage shot from across the street, the glass tower's entrance, security guards moving too fast to be human, and a shot of the lobby's glass doors where Lucien's reflection should have been, but was not. Just empty space where he had been standing, and the video was titled, "Vampires Run Ashford City Proof Inside," and the view count was already in the thousands, climbing fast, and Mara said, "Oh God," and Celine said, "It gets worse. The council has voted to eliminate him, Accord's protocol. Mortals who expose vampires are disappeared. Lucien has 6 hours to stop it, or Tyler is dead." And Mara said, "No, absolutely not." And Celine said, "Then you need to convince Lucien because right now he is downstairs arguing with the council and losing. They want Tyler gone. The video is spreading too fast. Even if the human police dismiss it as a hoax, the damage is done." And Mara ran. She found Lucien in his office and said, "You cannot kill him." And Lucien turned from the window where he had been staring at the city and said, "The council has already voted. I am out of options." And Mara said then, "Make new options. You are a king, act like it." And Lucien said, "What do you want me to do? He posted evidence of our existence online. He is a direct threat to the Accords." And Mara said, "So discredit him, make him look crazy, make the video look fake, but do not kill him. If you kill him, I will never forgive you." And Lucien stared at her and said, "You are choosing him." And Mara said, "I am choosing not to have blood on my hands. There is a difference." And Lucien was quiet for a long moment, and then said, "What do you suggest?" And Mara said, "Let me handle it. Let me record a statement. Say he is my stalker. The footage is doctored. I am filing a restraining order. It will discredit him enough to buy time." And Lucien said, "You would lie for me." And Mara said, "I would lie to save a life, even his, even if he does not deserve it." Celine came in then with a camera and a script she had written in 10 minutes flat, clinical and efficient, and Mara read it over and said, "This makes me look like a victim." And Celine said, "You are a victim. He stalked you, harassed you. Now he is trying to ruin you with fake evidence. Use it." And Mara thought about Tyler's face in the tower lobby, wild and desperate. Thought about the 3 years of texts and calls and surprise visits. Thought about the way he had never listened when she said no, and she said, "Fine, let us do this." The video took 6 takes because Mara kept tripping over the words, kept feeling like she was betraying something fundamental. But finally Celine said that one is good. We will post it and have our PR team amplify it. By tomorrow morning, Tyler will look like an obsessed ex with a vendetta, and the vampire video will look like a sad attempt at revenge. And Mara said, "And what happens when he does not stop?" And Lucien said, "Then we deal with it. But for now you bought him time, you saved his life, again. And Mara said I did not do it for him, and Lucien said I know. You did it because you have a moral line you will not cross, even for me, and I am beginning to think that is what I love most about you. And Mara looked at him and thought he just said love. He said it like it was simple, like it was true, and she did not know how to respond. So she just nodded and watched Celine post the video. Tyler's response came an hour later, a text that said, "You chose a monster over the truth. I will make you regret it." And Mara deleted it and thought he is not going to stop. He is going to keep coming, and eventually Lucian will stop listening to me, will stop choosing restraint over violence, and I do not know if I can live with that. But for now, Tyler is alive, and that has to be enough. The conclave happened 2 nights later at 11 p.m. exactly, the council invoking emergency session because Tyler's video had forced their hand, and Mara stood in the tower's glass atrium with Lucien beside her, and the entire vampire court watching from the mezzanine above, hundreds of eyes, silent and judging, and the 5 council elders sat in high-backed chairs arranged in a semicircle, and Cordelia said, "We are here to determine the legitimacy of the resonance bond between Lucian Ashford and Mara Torres. Evidence will be presented, a vote will be taken." And Celine stepped forward with a tablet and started reading. Emotional bleed confirmed. Mara experienced Lucian's memories on November 7th. Location tracking confirmed. Lucian can sense her presence across the city. Voluntary physical contact confirmed. Guards witnessed a kiss on the rooftop garden. All signs point to bond solidification. And Cordelia said, "And yet she has not formally accepted. The 30-day deal stands, which means the bond is conditional. And conditional bonds are weak bonds. They put the court at risk, and Marcus said we call for a vote to override the king's authority and invoke the covenant, claim the mortal by council decree, all in favor." And 3 hands went up, 3 out of 5, and Mara felt her heart stop because that was a majority. They were going to take her choice away. And Lucian said you cannot do this, and Cordelia said we can, and we are. You have proven yourself incapable of securing your echoed one. The court cannot afford weakness. And Mara thought no, not like this, and she stepped forward before she could think better of it and said, "I invoke right of voice." The atrium went silent, every conversation cutting off mid-word, and Cordelia said, "What did you say?" And Mara said, "Right of voice. I read it in the covenant texts. A mortal bound by resonance can speak at conclave if they are defending their bonded vampire. I am invoking that right." And Marcus said, "You have been studying our law." And Mara said, "I have been preparing for this. You think I did not know you would try to force me." And Cordelia leaned forward and said, "Very well. Mortal, speak." And Mara took a breath and thought, "This is it. This is the moment I either win or lose everything." She said, "You want proof the bond is real. I am standing here defending him. That is proof. I could have run, could have disappeared into the mortal world and made you hunt me. But I am here. I am negotiating. I am trying to make this work on my terms instead of yours. And that should tell you everything you need to know about whether the bond is real." And Cordelia said, "Or it tells us you are a clever mortal playing a dangerous game." And Mara said, "Then call my bluff. Claim me, force the bond, and see if it survives. See if Lucian can hold his throne when his echoed one hates him. When every vampire in this court knows he had to use force because he could not earn consent. You said it yourselves. Forced claims are weak. They are seen as failure. So go ahead. Vote. Take my choice away. And prove that consent means nothing to you. Prove that the Accord's founding principle, vampires protect mortals, not enslave them, is a lie." The council was silent, and Mara pressed on. Said, "I will make you a deal. I will accept the bond publicly on November 13th, the original deadline. I will stand in front of this court and say yes, freely, willingly, but only if you drop the covenant claim. Only if you protect me from Tyler, my ex, the mortal who is trying to expose you, and only if you give me your word that no other mortal will be forced into a resonance bond. That consent will be valued over convenience. And Marcus said you are making demands. A mortal making demands of the council. And Mara said I am negotiating, the same way I negotiated with Lucien. The same way I have been negotiating since the moment I walked into this tower, and if you cannot accept that, then you are not fit to rule. And Cordelia laughed, sharp and surprised, and said, You have spine, I will give you that. And looked at the other elders and said, What say you? Do we accept her terms? And there was a long silence, and then one by one the elders nodded, and Cordelia said, Very well. November 13th, you will accept the bond publicly. If you break your word, Lucian loses his throne and you are bound by council decree forever. Do you accept? And Mara said, I accept. And Lucian beside her said, I accept. And the conclave ended. The court filed out slowly, murmuring, and Mara stood in the empty atrium shaking. And Lucien said, You just saved my kingdom. And Mara said, I saved myself. You were just part of the deal. And Lucian said, Why did you do that? You could have walked away, let them force you, and then argued coercion. And Mara said, Because I am tired of being powerless, tired of letting other people make my choices, and you gave me the tools to fight back, the law, the knowledge, the time to prepare, and I am not going to waste that. And Lucien looked at her with something in his eyes that was too big to name, and said, I love you. And Mara said, I know, I can feel it through the bond. And Lucian said, And you? And Mara said, I do not know yet. Ask me on November 13th. And Lucian said, I will. And they walked out of the atrium together, and Mara thought I just negotiated my own cage. But at least it is a cage I chose. At least the bars are made of my words, not his. And that has to count for something. And November 13th was 5 days away. 5 days to decide if she could live with the choice she had just made. 5 days to figure out if the bond was love or just biology wearing love's face. And the waiting was going to be agony. Mara stood in the glass atrium after the conclave ended and felt the weight of what she had just done settle over her like a coat she was not sure fit. She had just promised to accept a supernatural bond in front of hundreds of vampires, had just negotiated her own future using laws she had learned from ancient texts in a library 3 nights ago. And Lucian touched her elbow gently and said, Come with me. And she let him lead her through the tower's silent hallways and up the stairs to the rooftop. And when they stepped through the door into the garden, she stopped because it was snowing. The first snow of the year was falling soft and thick through the glass dome, white flakes drifting down to melt on the winter roses, and the city below was blurred and quiet, all the hard edges softened, and Mara had not realized how much she needed this, needed quiet after the noise of the conclave, needed beauty after the ugliness of Tyler's video and the council's threats. And Lucian said, I thought you might want air, and Mara said, This is perfect, and meant it. They walked to the edge of the dome where the glass met the tower's stone parapet, and Lucian said, You meant it, what you said in there, November 13th, and Mara said, Yes, I meant it, and Lucian said, Why? You could have kept fighting, could have found another loophole, another delay, and Mara turned to look at him and said, Because I am tired of fighting, tired of running, and the bond has given me something I never had, choice backed by power. You swore to protect me. You taught me to fight your world's rules. You waited while I decided instead of forcing me. And that is worth something. That is worth choosing. And Lucian said, Even though you do not love me. And Mara said, I did not say that. I said I do not know yet. But I think I could. I think I am already halfway there and it terrifies me. And Lucian said, Why does it terrify you? And Mara said, Because loving you means accepting this world, means becoming part of something I do not fully understand, means trusting that the bond is real, and not just vampire biology wearing love's face. And I need 5 more days to be sure, 5 more days to know if what I feel is mine, or just an echo of what you feel bleeding through the resonance. Lucian was quiet for a moment, watching the snow fall, and then he said, I love you. I have loved you since the night you turned my law into a weapon, since you stood in my library and demanded a choice. And I will wait 5 days or 5 years or 5 centuries for you to be ready to say it back. I will wait until you are sure. And Mara felt something in her chest break open, because no one had ever said that to her before. No one had ever valued her choice that much. And she said, "What if I am never sure?" And Lucian said, "Then I will love you anyway, and let you go if that is what you need. But I do not think that is what you need. I think you need time. And time is the one thing I have in abundance." And Mara said 5 days, and Lucian said 5 days, and they stood there in the falling snow, and Mara thought, this is the moment. This is the choice, and she reached up and pulled him down and kissed him. His mouth was still cold, but it did not feel wrong anymore, did not taste like winter and iron, just tasted like him. And when she pulled back, she said, "I do not know if this is love yet, but I know I do not want to lose it." And Lucian said that is enough for now, and took off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. Even though he was the one who should be cold, vampires did not feel temperature the way mortals did, but he gave her his coat anyway, and Mara pulled it tight and said, "November 13th, I will say yes in front of everyone. I will accept the bond publicly." And Lucien said, "And I will spend the rest of my life proving you did not make a mistake." And they kissed again in the snow with the white roses blooming around them and the city sleeping below. And for the first time in 8 days, Mara felt something like peace, like she had stopped running and started choosing, and the difference was everything. She said, "What happens after I accept, after the bond is complete?" And Lucien said, "Then you are mine, and I am yours, legally, supernaturally, politically. The court will recognize you as my echoed one. You will have protection, status, a voice in vampire law if you want it, and if you choose immortality later, the option will be there. But there is no rush. We have time." And Mara said, "And Tyler?" And Lucian's expression went cold, and he said, "Tyler is a problem we will handle. The council agreed to protect you. That means eliminating threats." And Mara said, "Not by killing him." And Lucian said, "Then we find another way. We discredit him further. We make him irrelevant." "But Mara, you need to understand, he is not going to stop. He knows too much, and he is too angry, and eventually we will run out of options." And Mara said, "Then we deal with it when that happens, but not tonight. Tonight I just want this." And gestured to the garden and the snow and the quiet. And Lucien said, "Then you will have it, tonight and every night after." And they stood there until the snow stopped, and the sky started to lighten in the east. And Mara thought, I am going to accept a bond with a vampire king in 5 days. I am going to tie my life to his, and I am not sure if it is the smartest thing I have ever done or the most reckless, but it is mine, my choice, my terms, and that has to be enough. 300 miles away in a motel room that smelled like cigarettes and desperation. Tyler Vaughn sat on a sagging bed with his laptop open and his hands shaking, and he had been awake for 36 hours straight, digging through conspiracy forums and hacker sites and leaked document repositories. And he had found it, finally found it, an old Accords document from 1987, scanned and uploaded by someone who called themselves Nightwatch. And the document laid out vampire weaknesses in clinical detail. Sunlight, yes, but also silver, iron, certain frequencies of sound, and something called a severance ritual, a way to break a resonance bond if you had the right materials and the right words. And Tyler stared at the screen and thought, I can use this. I can break whatever hold he has on her. And he pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found a number he had saved 2 days ago, a number that had texted him after his video went viral. Someone who said they had information about Ashford City's shadow government, someone who wanted to meet. And Tyler had ignored it at first, thought it was a crank, but now he pulled up the message and read it again. You are not crazy. They are real. And they can be stopped. If you want to know how, text this number. And Tyler thought about Mara's face in the video she had posted, the way she had called him a stalker, the way she had chosen the monster over him, and he felt rage settle in his chest like a stone, and he typed out a message, I have what you need, let us talk, and hit send. The response came back in seconds. A location, an address on the edge of the city. Abandoned warehouse district, tomorrow night, come alone. And Tyler closed the laptop and lay back on the bed and thought, I am going to save her whether she wants me to or not. I am going to expose them all. And if I have to burn Ashford City to the ground to do it, then that is what I will do. And he closed his eyes and did not sleep, just lay there in the dark planning. And his phone buzzed once more, a final message from the unknown number. Bring the document. We will handle the rest. And the screen went black.